Welcome to Eyewitnesses, our IQ Church New Testament survey. This is part one of two. This is a 6-week course, and I'm so glad you're joining us for this adventure through the New Testament. Our hope and prayer is that this course will enable you to read the New Testament with confidence, so that when you open up to one of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, or Hebrews, or James, one of the general epistles, or even the book of Revelation, you have a basic understanding of what's going on there, and you have the tools you need to do further study so that when you come across a passage that seems confusing, that you are able to get the answers you need. So thank you so much for joining us. We're going to jump in with a fun video clip. This is from a Jesus film, and as we watch this, I want you to consider what all they got wrong about Jesus and what all they got right about Jesus in this clip.
Let your heart now be cleansed.
Forgive me. I have sinned. Help me to be strong.
Be strong. It is I who need baptism from you. And yet you come to me.
Let it be so. We must fulfill all righteousness.
Lord, Eternal Father, I hear your voice. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased.
So I'd love for you to think about what is inaccurate about this picture of Jesus. You know, when I watch this clip, one of the things I love is that they're trying to kind of go with both lines when it comes to the baptism of Jesus. So they show John the Baptist kind of do this sprinkling, pouring thing, and he holds his like 6 ounces of water, and then when he pours it out, Jesus's body is covered in water, as if he like just took a shower. It's like, I don't know how that water, if that's magical water. It's impressive. The other thing that drives me crazy about this clip is that Jesus cuts the line. Did you notice that? There's like hundreds of people waiting in line to be baptized by John, and Jesus just like walks up, cuts in front of them all, jumps in, gets baptized by John. And then finally, kind of just the overall awkwardness. When I watch this movie clip, every time I'm struck by how awkward and almost alien Jesus seems. And yet, Isaiah 53 says this prophecy about Jesus from the time of Isaiah, 700 years before Jesus came, said there's going to be nothing about this coming king that's like different than the average person. And so I think when Jesus walked around, there wasn't this weird music going on in the background. People weren't like, ooh, who is this guy? Like, he just looked like a normal first century Jewish man because he was one. He was more than that, we know, but he was not less than that. Now, that last question is for you to consider. How do you think the filmmakers would answer the question about how accurate they got Jesus? See, the other thing when I watch this video clip is I think about, look, I think I want to give these filmmakers the benefit of the doubt. They were doing the best they could to portray Jesus as accurately as they understood him. And I think they got him really wrong. But here's the humbling thing. These filmmakers were like, I don't know how old this clip is, maybe even 50 years old. That means that they were 50 years closer to the time of Jesus than we are now. And if they could get so many things wrong about Jesus, I think this should make us pause and consider, well, maybe we don't have everything absolutely right either. Maybe we have some things wrong about Jesus. And the troubling theological thing that I kind of want you to wrestle with is how many things are you allowed to get wrong about Jesus until you're not actually worshiping Jesus at all, right? Like idolatry is this whole thing of there's this false God that you're worshiping, not the real God. And how off can you be until it's not Jesus? Now, here's my snarky answer to that question is I don't want to know. I want to do everything I can to get as close as possible to the real Jesus. And that's what this class is about. We're studying the historical and cultural context about the first century and how these gospel writers wrote their gospels and why they included the things they did and what they would have thought about Jesus so that we can get Jesus as right as possible. So, as you look at the New Testament, when you open up to the New Testament, here is what you're going to see. You're going to see four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Then you're going to get to the book of Acts, a bunch of letters from Paul, in fact, 13 of them. And then what we call the general epistles or the general letters, or some people call them the Catholic, as in universal letters. That includes like Hebrews, James, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, 1st and 2nd Peter, and Jude. And then we have the book of Revelation. Now, real quick, I just want you to know where we're going in this class and how we're splitting things up. So oftentimes, New Testament survey courses, what they will do is they will take this just in canonical order. And what I mean is the order you come across when you open up the New Testament. And so, for example, when I went to seminary, when I took New Testament survey, they did it in two halves. And the first half was the Gospels and Acts. And then the second half was everything else. Now, that's kind of logical in that that's just how you come across the New Testament. But as Jake and I were preparing for this course, we felt like it wasn't the best split, especially in the fact that if you split it up that way, you end up doing 5 books the first semester and 22 books the second semester, which makes the second semester pretty overwhelming. And so we've decided to split things up a little differently. And so here's how we're going to split things up for our New Testament survey course here. We are going to deal in this class, in these next 6 weeks, with the 4 Gospels plus the general letters, there's 8 of those, and then the book of Revelation. And what that amounts to is 13 books. And that saves for second semester 14 books, the book of Acts and the letters of Paul. And I think actually these go together in a really cool way. We labeled this class Eyewitnesses because we're looking at the eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus, the people who saw him and wrote what they saw as preserved in the Gospels. And then we're looking at letters that many of those same eyewitnesses wrote. 1st and 2nd Peter were written by Peter. And he is the one who would get the source material for the Gospel of Mark, for example. And so these are the eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus and then the writings that those eyewitnesses wrote. So here is our plan for how we're going to cover those things and when we're going to cover what. So in this first session, we're going to get an introduction to the New Testament. We're also going to look at the events that happened between when the Old Testament ended and the New Testament started. And then finally, we're going to dig in and look at and study the Gospel of Mark together. So that's the plan for today in our first session. In our second section, we'll look at the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Session 3, we're going to save the Gospel of John for later. I'll explain why in a moment. Session 3, we'll look at the books of Hebrews and James. Session 4, 1st and 2nd Peter and Jude. Session 5, we're going to put the Gospel of John with the letters of John. Since he authored both of these, we're going to put all of this together. The Gospel of John and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And then finally, we're going to conclude with the revelation of Jesus Christ, which was also written by the Apostle John. So without further ado, we're going to get into our content for today, which covers introductory material, which we've done a little bit of already, as well as the Gospel of Mark. So first of all, if you've been following along with our fantastic book, I hope you have. We also sent out some Bible project videos, and we gave you some pre-work to discuss. So this is just some of our pre-work kind of homework, if you will, to set the table for this class. And if you're watching this with someone else, please pause the video at this point and share your findings to these questions with each other. All right, I hope you had a good discussion for those opening items. We are going to return to some of those questions as when we get into the Gospel of Mark. For now, I wanted to do some historic filling in because you may not know this, but when you turn the page from the Old Testament which concludes with the book of Malachi, the prophecies of Malachi. And then when you turn the page and you get to the Gospel of Matthew, you just skipped 400 years. And many people just don't even realize that. And so it's really important for us to fill in some gaps historically and talk about what happened between when the Old Testament was finished and before Jesus comes on the scene in the New Testament, so that we understand Jesus in light of his historical context. This is also going to help us understand some of the main groups of people that Jesus interacts with, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and those kinds of things. So first of all, quick review of the Old Testament and then where it ends. If you're familiar with the Old Testament story, right, it begins in Genesis with God creating everything, then the fall, and eventually God calls this man named Abraham. And he says, Abraham, I want to bless you. And through you and your family, I want to bless the entire world. And that begins this project, and that begins a story that the Bible follows of this family of Abraham, who eventually does become a nation. And that nation is stuck in Egypt under slavery for a number of years, and this Moses brings them out. And eventually they make their way to the promised land, and they have this kingdom of Israel finally. The first king is Saul, then David, and then his son Solomon. And that all happens right around 1000 BC was when David reigns over Israel. Now, in the time of David's grandson, Rehoboam, that kingdom is split by civil war. And after that point, you have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And both of those kingdoms are ultimately conquered. First, Israel in 722 BC by the Assyrians, and then later, Judah, the southern kingdom, is conquered by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC, and the people are taken into exile. They're taken out of their homeland. They're taken away to Babylon. Eventually, if you remember, you can read about this in the book of Daniel. You also get hints of this in the book of Esther. Eventually, the Medes and the Persians conquer the Babylonians. And so now there's a new empire on the scene. And Cyrus, one of the Persian rulers, says, hey, all of you Israelites who came from Judah, you can go back home. And he gives them permission to go back and rebuild. And you can read about these events in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And that's where they rebuild the wall around Jerusalem and they rebuild the temple. But the glory is not what it was. God's presence doesn't seem to enter the temple, and the people are kind of suffering, and they're still being ruled by Persia. They don't have their own kingdom. It's kind of this disappointing thing. This is called the Second Temple period because they've rebuilt the temple. And that's the time when Malachi, the last of the Old Testament prophets, is prophesying. He's actually encouraging Ezra and Nehemiah and the leaders of that time to do the rebuilding and encouraging them. And then the Old Testament ends, and that's around 400 BC. And so again, you have these 400 years, some people call this the 400 years of silence. And so what happens in Israel and in the world during those 400 years? Well, let's fill in some of those gaps. First of all, what happens is eventually another kingdom rises to power after the Persians, and that's the kingdom of the Greeks. Many of you are probably familiar with Alexander the Great, who conquered, the known world of the time. He was a crazy conqueror, and he also spread Greek culture like crazy, spread it far and wide, and that's called Hellenism or Hellenization, where Greek culture was just taught and input. A bunch of people and a bunch of lands were forced to learn Greek and adopt Greek ways and eat Greek foods and all these things. Now, Alexander died at a young age, around 32, and he did not have an heir. And so in the aftermath, after some squabbling, eventually they decided, you know what, we're going to take Alexander's kingdom and we're going to give it to his four main generals and just split it into four pieces. And what's important for us to see, and what was important for the people of Israel, is that the land of Israel was right in between the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Assyria. And so what happened for the next 200 years or so is they got kind of passed back and forth. And so sometimes the Ptolemies would be stronger and they would take over the land of Israel. Sometimes the Seleucids were stronger and they would take over the land of Israel. Now, what's also going on spiritually in the land of that time is there's, among a lot of Jewish people, there's this attraction towards Greek culture. This Hellenization is taking effect in Israel too. And a lot of individual Jews are like, this Greek culture is not so bad. What's wrong with it? And starting to adopt Greek ways. Now, there's another voice in the Israelite culture at that time, and they are warning about this influence. They're saying, no, guys. Like, we have to be true to our roots. We have to be true to the Lord's ways. We have to continue to speak Hebrew, and we have to pass on our culture and preserve that. we need to remain pure. And so this group was actually called the Hasidim, which means like the upright ones or the pure ones. In fact, even today in Jerusalem, you'll go and you'll see some Jews wear these traditional robes and nice suits and have, but they're called Hasidic Jews. It comes from that word for pure or pious ones. So the Hasidim are warning about Hellenization, and then a lot of the people are kind of like, we're not so sure. We're kind of playing with that culture. And then a man rises to power by the name of Antiochus. He's Antiochus the Fourth, actually. And then he labels himself Epiphanes, or manifestation, because Antiochus the Fourth is kind of crazy, and he believes he is the manifestation of the gods. And he does not like the Jewish people. So this Seleucid ruler rises to power. He has control of the Holy Land during this time. Because of a number of events, the Jews fall out of favor with him. And so he actually comes into Jerusalem, and his goal for a period of time is to get rid of Judaism, to just squash it out. And so he forbids circumcision. He tries to get them not to eat kosher. And the ultimate desecration is that he takes over the temple, he conquers it, and he sacrifices pigs on the holy altar. Now, what's interesting is that this actually does the very opposite of what he intends, right? He intends to do away with Judaism, and this is so offensive and so obviously terrible that what it does is it causes a revolution. And the people rise up and gather together and form a rebellion against Antiochus IV. And they are actually successful. You can read about this in the history of the Maccabees. First and Second Maccabees records this kind of guerrilla warfare. And what's so crazy is that they actually do it. They actually win. They take back their land. And this starts something called the Hasmonean dynasty. And the Hasmoneans are just kind of this ruling class that emerges after this revolution. So they get their land back. And then you know what happens? These new kings of Israel, who were leaders of the rebellion, begin to benefit from their rule and kind of get fat off of it and begin to oppress their fellow Israelites in the land. And all of this is set up for these four kind of voices that have emerged by the time we get to the first century. And so I want to talk about those four voices, and these are four groups that you will meet when you read the New Testament and the Gospels. First of all, we have the group of the Pharisees. The Pharisees can trace their roots back to those Hasidim who are warning this other culture is dangerous. We need to be aware of it. We need to stay pious and focus on our holiness. They're warning about the influence of Greek culture and later about Roman culture. So the Pharisees believed that political power was corrupting. We don't want anything to do with political power. We want to focus on purity, personal purity. And they really emphasize you being loyal to the law, right? You need to observe God's ways and focus on that. Now, sometimes they focused on the externals. That's something that Jesus criticizes the Pharisees for in the New Testament. I do want to talk about one misconception. Some people have wrongly taught or simplified the Pharisees and said that that what they were teaching was that you had to obey the law in order to earn God's favor. And that's actually a misconstrual and misconception. That's not what the Pharisees were taught teaching. Perhaps a few Pharisees believe that, but by and large, they understood the Old Testament story that God rescued his people from Egypt and from slavery, and then gave them the law. Right? You don't earn God's favor. No, he's given his favor, and now, in order to be loyal to this God, you need to obey his ways. So that is the group of the Pharisees. If you want the cheesy mnemonic device, the Pharisees are fair, right? This emphasis on adherence to the law. Now, there's another group that traces its roots back to those original Hasidim, back to those original people who are warning against the influence of Greek culture. And that is the group of the Essenes. The mnemonic device for this is Essenes were ascetic. Ascetic refers to people who kind of push away kind of worldly desires and wants. Oftentimes there's an emphasis on simple food or even fasting, celibacy. And the Essenes were marked by all of these things. There were a group that said, no, we're not even just about holiness. We're about withdrawal from the world. We need to get out of that corrupt culture, those corrupt cities, those corrupt communities, and we need to form our own communities where we can follow the law perfectly. And so they formed all these small communities all across Judea. And there was one group, a very famous group, in a place called Qumran, which is near En-Gedi. They are the ones who actually produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is a picture of the caves at Qumran. The Dead Sea Scrolls are immensely important for our study of the Old Testament and our confidence that it was translated and then copied accurately for hundreds and hundreds of years. You can dig more into that if you want. Now, there's none of the New Testament here because the New Testament hadn't been written yet when the Essenes were here. But the Essenes were this kind of group that emphasized withdrawal. And when you look at John the Baptist and then think about what the Essenes were like, there's a lot of similarities. So much so that many scholars believe that either John the Baptist was an Essene, or at least he was very strongly influenced by the way they chose to follow the law. All right, next up we have the Sadducees. The Sadducees are basically the descendants of those rulers that kind of became corrupt. They liked being in power. They liked all the benefits that came with. They became landowners and exerted their influence and power. And that's the trickle down of who the Sadducees were by the time we get to the New Testament. They're the ones who have control of the temple and the high priesthood when we get to the time of Jesus. So they're the aristocrats. They're the wealthy landowners. And they emphasize strongly the first 5 books of the Torah, also known as the written law. And because of that, and because of kind of their literalistic approach, they tended to deny the resurrection, the afterlife, or future world. And so when you come across them, that's oftentimes what they're testing Jesus on and trying to trick him with questions about, right? The Sadducees, again, are also the ones in power. So when you read about like Caiaphas, who was the high priest at the time of Jesus, and had a hand in condemning him and kind of giving this basically very false trial of Jesus, he was a member of the party of the Sadducees. So the Sadducees, descendants of those original rulers. Now there's one more group we need to talk about, and that is the Zealots. Oh, sorry, I forgot your mnemonic device. Sadducees are sad because there's no afterlife, right? So Pharisees are fair, Essenes are ascetic, Sadducees are sad. Finally, we have the Zealots. The Zealots are extremists. They are the revolutionaries. Basically, if you want to understand the Zealots, you just go back to what happened with the Maccabees. They had a revolution and it worked. Through violent revolution, they were able to get their land back. And so the Zealots said, look, they did it with the Greeks, we can do it with the Romans. And so the Zealots were basically violent revolutionaries. They wanted to get rid of Rome and they wanted to do it through violence. They advocated guerrilla warfare tactics. There was a group of Zealots in the first century called the Sicarii, which is the name for a very short sword. They would hide these short swords in their robes and then just like quickly stab Roman soldiers and guards. And one of Jesus's disciples belonged to this group. Simon the Zealot was a zealot. And then you had Levi, the tax collector, who was helping Rome. And it's crazy that these people were united under Jesus as his disciples. So those are the 4 groups that emerged by the time of Jesus. And hopefully you understand now why these groups emerged and why they had the emphases that they did. And so when you come across them in the New Testament, I hope this helps you understand what's going on there. Now, a final note before we get to the Gospel of Mark is that by the time we get to Jesus, it's not Greek rule anymore, right? By the time we get to the New Testament, now Rome has taken over and they have conquered the world, and Judea is under the rule of Rome when we open the pages of the New Testament. All right, we're going to turn the page and look now with all of this knowledge at the Gospel of Mark. And after I do some kind of preview and overarching ideas, Jake is going to dig into some specific passages and show how these themes emerge. But first, let's talk about what a gospel is. We call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John gospels, which many of you know. That's just the word for good news, euangelion in Greek, and it means good news. But it's important for us to know that the word gospel, that describes the content of these books. That's not actually what kind of books they are. That's not what kind of writing they are. In the first century, there was no genre or type of writing called gospel. They had letters, epistles, they had apocalypses, which Revelation is, but there was no such thing as a gospel. So when we look at one of the gospels, the word gospel defines the content, but not the genre, the type of writing. The kind of writing we're looking at is the equivalent of a first century biography, or bioi, that's the plural, bio, a life. That's the word for life, right? Biology is the study of life. A bioi is a writing about someone's life. Now, when you understand that, it brings some things to light, because first century biographies were a little bit different than our modern day biographies. I remember reading, and actually didn't even get all the way through it, but I remember reading a biography about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And the author went into such great depth. Like, he did so much research. Like, I remember this one time where he's like, and he caught the train that leaves at like 9:38 a.m. and went on that train on this specific day to go to this place and then did this thing. And there's this just amazing attention to detail in our modern day biographies. That was not true for first century biographies, because that's not what they thought was most important. First century biographies focused on the character and identity of who they were talking about, what they were trying to do. And this is true not just of our gospels, this is true of any first century biography you come across, whether it's, maybe a document about the life of Julius Caesar. You'll see the same thing. There's oftentimes a downplaying of their childhood, because they just thought, well, that doesn't have much to do with their greatest deeds that show their character and who they are. And so here's the point for us as we look at the Gospels. First century biographies were more concerned with character than chronology. We're very focused on what happened when, what is the sequential order. They were very focused on who is this person and how do we understand them and how do their great deeds and their great teachings show us that. Their concern is getting right who Jesus was and whatever mechanisms and literary things they can do to make that clear. So when we turn to the Gospel of Mark, why are we talking about Mark first? A couple of reasons. Even though Matthew is the first gospel you come across in the New Testament, Mark, we believe, was the first of the Gospels written. So we're dealing with it first. We believe it was written by John Mark, who was, we have reason to believe, actually acquainted with Jesus's teaching and maybe adjacent to following him before Jesus' death and resurrection, but very certainly he was part of the early church. In fact, you can read something about John Mark in Acts 12, and I think this story brings to light some insight about the writer of this gospel. Acts 12 records how at one point Peter is locked up in prison for preaching the gospel. He's in prison, and then the believers pray for him, and then an angel comes and lets Peter out of prison. Now, what happens next is what's important for our purposes. Peter wanders through Jerusalem and he goes to the house of John Mark, to John Mark's mother's house, Mary. So this is Acts 12:12. It says this: when Peter realized that this wasn't a dream, it was really happening, he went to the home of Mary, the mother of John Mark. This is the same John Mark who we believe wrote this gospel, where many were gathered for prayer. He knocked at the door and the gate, and a servant girl named Rhoda came to open it. When she recognized Peter's voice, she was so overjoyed that instead of opening the door, she ran back inside and told everyone, "Peter's standing at the door." "You're out of your mind," they said. When she insisted, they decided it must be his angel. And meanwhile, Peter continued knocking. When they finally opened the door and saw him, they were amazed. And then he tells them what happened. Now here's the important things: that John Mark is already part of the church, but not only that, but he seems to come from a wealthy family, right? Mary's home, John Mark's mother, is big enough that many believers, it says, can gather there. And not only that, we know they have a servant to answer the door for them, Rhoda. So it looks like John Mark comes from a wealthier family, who had a home in Jerusalem, and also that he's very connected with Peter early on. And in fact, later on, 1 Peter 5:13, when Peter is writing from Rome to the believers, he says that Mark is with him and sends his greetings. So here's the payoff for all of that. We think John Mark was a member of a wealthier family, and he decided to follow Jesus, and he eventually became a companion to Peter, especially when Peter was serving in Rome near the end of his life. We also know that earlier, John Mark was a missionary companion of Paul. And so his gospel does reflect eyewitness detail, as well as we believe most of his source material was not actually his own firsthand account, but Peter's firsthand account. And so John Mark is just recording, really, if you want to, it's the gospel according to Peter, but John Mark is telling the story. We believe the date, it was likely the 50s or 60s. So Jesus died maybe 32, 33 AD. So this is very early after Jesus' death and resurrection. We don't know exactly if it's the 50s or 60s. We do have good reason to believe it's before 70, because in the year 70, the temple was destroyed. And the way that Mark writes about Jesus' predictions about the destruction of the temple, it's very likely that this is being written before that actually happened. It also fits the context of believers facing persecution in Rome. So perhaps Nero's persecution in Rome has begun, and perhaps even Peter's locked up in prison under this persecution. And so John Mark wants to write this before Peter dies and maybe get his approval of this gospel. So again, it's widely considered the earliest gospel, probably written specifically to Roman Christians facing persecution. So that's some background information. If you want a handout, we have handouts, and you can kind of complete this basic information for each of the gospels along the way. I do want to next talk about the literary structure of Mark's gospel. And the literary structure is actually pretty clear. He tells us at the beginning, in the middle, and the end who Jesus is, the Son of God, the Christ. So first verse, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That's who Mark believes Jesus to be and who is going to try and show us how Jesus is. And then if you look at it, there's this really interesting point in the middle. And then when you separate it out, you have kind of Jesus' public ministry versus his private ministry in the second half. You have ministry in Galilee in the first half, and then his Jesus on the way to Jerusalem and ministering in Jerusalem in the second half. You have growing popularity in the first half. You have growing opposition in the second half. And if the driving question in the whole first half is, who is Jesus? Is he the Messiah? Which finally gets answered right in the middle point. Yes, he is, according to Peter. And Jesus says, yes, you're right, Peter. And then now the whole second half is like, what kind of Messiah, though, is he? What kind of king or Christ is he? And then finally the conclusion, the centurion who sees how Jesus died says, surely this man was the Son of God. And so I want to talk about that midpoint really quickly, because that's kind of the hinge point of the Gospel of Mark, where you move from, is Jesus the Messiah, to, yes, he is, but now what kind of king is he going to be, which is a key idea in the Gospel of Mark. So if you have your Bible, you can follow along. This is in Mark chapter 8. Mark chapter 8. Now, Mark chapter 8 records, in verse 22, you get this interesting story about Jesus healing a blind man. Okay, so 8:22 says they go to this place called Bethsaida, and Jesus heals a blind man. And it's the only time that Mark records where healing is not complete and instantaneous. Instead, what happens is Jesus heals the blind man. He says, "Can you see?" And the blind man says, "Sort of. I see people, but they look like trees walking around." And then Jesus does like this additional healing, and then he can see clearly. That happens, then pay attention to this. Right after that, Mark puts the declaration of Jesus being the Christ by Peter. Right after that. I think this is important. So it says, Jesus and his disciples, they left Galilee. They went up to the villages near Caesarea Philippi. As they were walking along, Jesus asked them, who do people say I am? Well, they replied, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and others say you are one of the other prophets. And then he asked them, but who do you say I am? And Peter replied, you are the Messiah. And from our reading, we know that means you're the king. You're the king we've been waiting for, the one from the line of David, the one promised in 2 Samuel 7. You're the king who's coming. But Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. And this is like the first healing of the blind man. The disciples see, but as we'll see, they don't see totally clearly yet. Because right after this, it says this, then Jesus began to tell them what kind of Messiah he's going to be. He began to tell them that the Son of Man must suffer many terrible things and be rejected by the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of the religious law. He would be killed, but 3 days later, he would rise from the dead. As he talked about this openly with his disciples, Peter took him aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. Jesus turned around and looked at his disciples and then reprimanded Peter. Get away from me, Satan, he said. You are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God, not from God's point of view. And then he goes on. So here's the idea. Just like the blind man sort of got his sight, but then needed further healing, it's like Mark is saying the disciples sort of understood that Jesus was the king, but they needed this further insight to understand what kind of king he would be. And that insight comes in the whole second half of the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus goes to Jerusalem and he is killed and he suffers on the cross, and then he does rise again. And so here's our main idea for the Gospel of Mark. We're going to give you a main key idea. This is kind of just a summary of each book. I'm going to do my best to make these memorable and sometimes even rhymey for you. I know that can be cheesy, but hopefully it just gives you a mental handle for the book as a whole. Here's the key idea for the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is the king, revealed by the servant's cross, not by the conqueror's crown. Jesus is the king. He is the Messiah. But what kind of Messiah he is? Not marked by the conqueror's crown, but by the servant's cross. This is the main idea of the Gospel of Mark. So now we're going to turn. I'm going to invite Jake to present and share with us how some of these themes emerge in the Gospel of Mark, and then he's going to dig into some additional themes that you see over and over again and give us practice reading these texts.
Today, I have been tasked with talking about some of the themes and some of the style points that Mark uses in his gospel. One of the major themes that we're going to be talking about, Luke kind of mentioned it earlier, it's called the Markan secret. Sometimes it's talked about as the Messianic secret. The Markan secret is kind of a subset of the Messianic secret, where the Messianic secret is about this idea that Jesus says, hey, don't tell people about me, don't tell people about me, and trying to keep things down. The Markan secret is specific to the book of Mark in that there's this weird thing where throughout most of the book, there's observant outsiders and ignorant insiders. There's this thing going on where all the people that shouldn't know about the Messiah and shouldn't understand, they understand. And all the people who should understand, they don't get it. And basically, besides God, this is very consistent throughout the book. And we'll talk about why Mark does that. So what we're going to do is I'm going to just kind of go through 3 examples of each the observant outsider and the ignorant insider so that you can get a feeling for looking for these things as you go through it. Basically, you can't go through a chapter of Mark without seeing at least one of these, if not both, because it's so prevalent. And that's one of the reasons why we're talking about it, because the fact that it's so prevalent means that it's probably very important to understanding the book of Mark. So when it comes to observant outsiders, this is going all the way back to the first time this happens. And we see in Mark 1:21 through 34, it says, they went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. Just then, a man in their synagogue who was possessed by an impure spirit cried out, what do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Be quiet, said Jesus sternly. Come out of him. The impure spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. The people were all so amazed that they asked each other, what is this, a new teaching? And with authority, he even gives orders to the impure spirits, and they obey him. News about him spread quickly over the whole region of Galilee. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they immediately told Jesus about her. So he went to her, he took her and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. That evening, after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. And so here we actually do see a little bit of the ignorant insider thing taking place here too, with people go, what is this teaching? When they're the people who are supposed to understand. They're the Jewish people. And actually what I think is so interesting is that besides God at Jesus' baptism, this is the first time in the gospel that someone proclaims that Jesus is the Holy One of God. And it's a demon. Now, there's lots of reasons for this, and we're not going to go too deep into them, but one of them is that the demons are trying to subvert Jesus' mission of secrecy by proclaiming. And that's part of what's going on. That's part of the Messianic secret, because they know that the people who are listening are going to misinterpret what it means to be the Messiah. But in a more thematic way for Mark, this is showing, look, there's people who shouldn't be following Jesus or maybe shouldn't know, who know and proclaim, and they know immediately who Jesus is. Okay. Finally, this one's not about demons. It's actually about a blind man. And we'll talk about this as we go. So then they came to Jericho as Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city. A blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." So they called to the blind man, "Cheer up, on your feet. He's calling you." Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked him. The blind man said, "Rabbi, I want to see." "Go," said Jesus, "your faith has healed you." Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. Okay, we might miss this, though maybe we don't. The fact that the blind man is one of the outsiders in this world. We can actually even see it a little bit if you look at the text. When he's calling for mercy, everyone's like, "Shut up, blind beggar person." And this is because in Jerusalem, this goes back all the way to the time of Ezekiel and before, there was this thought that if you were born blind, it was because you were being punished either for your sins or for your parents' sins. And so this person is not only a social outcast, this person is a sinner who is the way they are for their own fault or for their parents' fault. And he calls out, he says, "Son of David." And it's very interesting that he says "Son of David" because this seems to be him declaring Jesus the Messiah. Son of David is part of the messianic prophecies. This is not like, "Oh, you're a rabbi who's related to David." This is him saying, "You're the Messiah. You're the one who's come to save." And it's actually really interesting. There's a side tangent. There's a writer named Flannery O'Connor. She's really good. And one of the things that she does in a lot of her books is she connects mental problems to physical problems. And we actually see kind of this thing where the only person seeing clearly is the person who can't see. And he says, "I want my sight." And yet there are so many people around who think they see, but they don't. And that's one of the points that Mark is trying to get across. Okay, now let's go look at some ignorant insiders. Okay, then this is Mark 3. This is like 8 verses after one of our observant outsiders. Then Jesus entered a house, and again a crowd gathered, so that he and his disciples were not even able to eat. When his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him. For they said, "He is out of his mind." And the teachers of the law came down from Jerusalem, saying, "He is possessed by Beelzebul, by the prince of demons. He is driving out demons." Okay, we see two groups that should really, really know who Jesus is. One of them had an angel come and tell them that Jesus was really important and was the Messiah. And his mom and his brothers are like, "Jesus, you need to really stop. You're being a little bit too out there with your teaching." These people, more than anybody, especially Mary and Joseph, should know that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is giving a teaching with authority and power, and yet they don't get it. And then we see the teachers of the law. These are the people who are the most learned people in the town, and they are the ones who should know about the prophecy, should know about the power that Jesus has, and yet they not only don't see it, they claim that it's the exact opposite. Okay? Now, Mark 8:27 through 33. So Luke talked about this passage earlier. So I'm not going to read it again and go through it, but I am going to talk a little bit about what is going on and how this shows the ignorant insiders. We see the proclamation by a disciple that Jesus is the Messiah. Okay, so we see Peter makes this proclamation, this good proclamation, but he's still an ignorant insider because he doesn't understand what the Messiah is. He doesn't get it. He doesn't get the fact that the Messiah has to actually do these things. He thinks that he knows better. He knows his culture of the Messiah being a conquering king is blinding him to the truth of who the Messiah actually is and what he has to do. We see in Mark 14:60 through 65, Jesus actually going to the most insider of insider people. He's going to the Sanhedrin, which is a ruling council of Jewish religious leaders. There's 100 of them, and it's approximately like 60-40 Sadducees to Pharisees. The Sadducees have the power here, but the Pharisees still have a say. So he goes before the religious elite of the elite, and this is during his trial before them. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" So they ask very directly, Give us this information. I am, said Jesus, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. The high priest tore his clothes. Why do we need any more witnesses? He asked. You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? They all condemned as worthy of death. They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, Prophesy. And the guards took him and beat him. So they asked him very directly, Are you the Messiah? And he actually, if you read this whole statement, he gives not one, not two, not three. There are 4 separate claims in that one sentence to being the Messiah and God. He couldn't tell them more directly, these learned people, and they react as they would if they thought he was lying, because maybe they do, maybe they don't, but they react in this way to say, you're not who you say you are. So finally, we're actually going to see these come together kind of at the apex of this book. And as we go through this series, through this class, we're going to see that a lot of the writers are making these arguments where they're sprinkling them throughout the whole book. And there's kind of a climax that comes to it at the end. I think this is the climax of the Markan secret at the very end. It says, At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lemna sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing nearby heard this, they asked, Listen, he's calling Elijah. Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine and vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down, he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. Okay, so we see the final moment of Jesus before the crucifixion, and all the people who should know that this is a messianic prophecy don't get it. And they go, if he's really who he says he is, he'll get himself off the cross. The person who's supposed to be the king of the Jews and the savior of Israel, they're like, if it's real, he'll pull himself down. And they wait. But on the opposite side, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood in front of Jesus saw how he died, the centurion, that's the guy who's in charge of 100 Roman soldiers. And the reason he's there is probably because he's in charge of the crucifixion. He said, surely this man was the Son of God. And this is a big deal for the centurion to say that, because when the centurion says that, he knows that that is the title of Caesar, the Son of God. It's actually even on their Roman coins, Augustus Caesar, Son of God. Okay? So it's a big deal that we see the outsiders understanding and the insiders not. And all of this leads to one of the weird things about the book of Mark. The book of Mark ends with this almost random ending, it feels like. And I think the Markan secret is the reason why it ends here. And you'll notice in your Bibles, you might have more verses, and you'll probably have a little note that says, hey, this is where it stops, but there's this extra part that got added on. And it's probably because the people who added this extra part on thought that this didn't end very well. We're going to read it and talk about why. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in white robes sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Don't be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. So what's the challenge here? The challenge is, are you going to be an ignorant insider or an observant outsider? Are you going to be someone who flees and doesn't tell anybody because you're worried or because you don't believe it? Or are you going to be someone who understands and tells others? And that's the final challenge of the book of Mark. Are you going to be like the centurion? Or are you going to be like the Jewish people who crucify their Messiah? Okay, with that, we are going to transfer over to kind of a little bit of a different thing. And this is more of a style point. It's called intercalation. You don't need to remember that word. Basically, it's when you have a narrative interruption, which is with an inserted episode. It's used to shed light on, contrast with, and enrich the surrounding story, or the opposite way, when the outside kind of helps us understand the inside. Basically, it's a sandwich. Okay, and we're going to look at a few of these. Actually, in your like pre-work reading, you went through one of these, and we're going to go through, and we're actually even going to practice a little bit with what's going on. So this is one of those that you went through in your pre-work for the class. And one of the things that we see in this passage, this is the passage of Jairus' daughter, where Jairus, he comes and he asks Jesus to heal his daughter. There's a woman who touches his cloak, Jesus' cloak, to be healed, and then it resumes the story of the healing of Jairus' daughter. And the reason this is an important, or the reason this happens is because the healing of the woman, that she is healed by faith in Christ and his power, not even by Christ's direct words, shows how important faith is to heal the healing process. It highlights how important the faith aspect is in the healing of Jairus' daughter and in all of the miracles of Jesus. Now, the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were only 2 days away, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him, but not during the festival. They said, or the people may riot. While he was in Bethany, reclining at the table of the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why is this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages, and the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her harshly. "Leave her alone," said Jesus. "Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money, so he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. So, the opposite sides of this story about Jesus being anointed by perfume is the story of the chief priests and the teachers of the law scheming, and then them getting an ally in their scheming, Judas, to go against him. And what this is showing with the perfume thing is Mark's actually showing us through the story, Jesus knows. And if these stories were separate, or if it told like them separately, you probably wouldn't see that Jesus is very knowing about his death. Jesus is very knowing about it. He's not surprised by Judas. He's not surprised by the teachers of the law. He is the only one who actually understands what he is going to. Okay, so this is our last one of the intercalations. These are all over the book of Mark, and when you read the book of Mark, I want you to look out for these in the future. And this one, I've played a little trick. What I've done is I've only included the middle part of the story. And what I don't want you to do is I don't want you to read the outer part yet. We're going to read this, and then what I want you to do is I want you to pause the video, and I want you to think about what this is saying. And then we're going to read the full text and see if that offers us more understanding of the story in the middle and the story on the outside. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry on merchandise through the temple courts. And he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, my house will be called the house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers?" The chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him because the whole crowd was amazed at this teaching. When evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. So go ahead and pause and think about what this story is teaching us. Okay, so if you're like me, if you just read this story by itself, you would think, wow, this is showing the corruption of the temple. This is showing the problems that are going on that Jesus may be trying to correct. But we're going to zoom out a little bit. I'm just going to read the extra part on the beginning, the extra part at the end, and we'll see what's going on here. The next day, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. When he reached it, he found nothing but leaves because it was not the season for figs. Then he said to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard him say it. And then at the end, in the morning, right after they're leaving from this temple overturning, as they went along, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. Peter remembered and said to Jesus, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered." Now, Israel throughout the Old Testament is often talked about as a tree and sometimes even as a fig tree. And what's happening here is that Jesus sees that there is no fruit in Israel, and he condemns the fig tree, and he goes in and he sees there's no fruit in the temple, and he condemns the temple. And in this curse of the temple, he's showing that he is going to tear down that temple of his body and rebuild it in 3 days, that he is going to do a bigger thing, that it's not about the physical temple anymore, that it's not about the physical Jerusalem anymore. Now it's about the temple that is the church, the living temple, which we'll see when we go to the class in 1 Peter, the living temple that is his followers. And we see here maybe one of the strongest condemnations of the temple system that's been ruined, and the leaders and the teachers of the law, that they will be like the fig tree, withered and cursed. So there is kind of this, hopefully this will help you as you read the book of Mark in the future. It's not actually your homework, but whether you do it this week or in the future, just read through the book of Mark and see all the places the intercalations are, all the places where the ignorant insiders and the observant outsiders are, and see the story that Mark is trying to craft for you, that Mark is trying to show you the truth through all of these little things, because he is, just like all the gospel writers, an excellent story writer who has a major purpose that he wants you to get. Luke is going to come and conclude the book of Mark, so get ready for that.
Part of what we're trying to show you in this course is that when you understand the historical and cultural context behind these books, it can bring them to life and bring things out in the text you might not have ever seen before. And so as we conclude, I want to offer kind of a worshipful reflection on the cross of Jesus by looking at something you might not know about that I didn't know about for years as a follower of Jesus. And that is about how Caesars would be crowned Caesar when they were chosen. Here are just some of the elements of Caesar's coronation around the time of the 1st century. So first, when there was going to be a new Caesar, a new ruler over the Roman Empire, the Caesar would gather in the Praetorian with the Praetorian Guard, 6,000 soldiers. Because remember, originally the Caesar was the general of the army. So he would gather with his soldiers in the Praetorian. The guards would place a purple robe on him and an olive leaf wreath crown on his head, and then give him a scepter, and the scepter signified his rule over all of Rome. Then what would happen next is he would be loudly proclaimed as triumphant, right? Lots of cheering, right? Caesar is Lord, Caesar is King, even Caesar is the Son of God. Then they would have this great parade through the streets of Rome, and accompanying Caesar, right in the middle of this parade, would be a bull for a sacrifice that would happen later. They would make their way slowly through the streets of Rome in this big parade, all the way to the Capitoline Hill, which you can go to today. Capitoline, by the way, means head hill. That's where the bull would be offered as the sacrifice, and the thought and the belief was that this would kind of make Caesar into some kind of god. And they would look for signs from the gods. So Caesar would ascend to his throne, and he would have his next in command on his right and left. And the crowd would acclaim the new emperor. People would look for signs of approval from the heavens and from the gods. And so if you were really lucky and you were a Caesar, you might get like an eagle or perhaps a flock of doves, or sometimes they would even get an eclipse. And it was like this sign that they looked for from the gods of affirmation of Caesar really is God, and this is the God's choice of our next Caesar. So again, summary points here. Now, if you keep this in mind, and then read Mark chapter 15. And then you read the response that Jake talked about of the centurion who was there at the crucifixion of Jesus. And when the centurion who stood facing Jesus saw that in this way he breathed his last. And when I read those words, in this way, I think of all these things, that they've gone to Golgotha, the hill of the skull in Jerusalem. And there's been this beating of Jesus by the Praetorian, and they dressed him up in this robe to make fun of him, and gave him a scepter, and then gave him a crown of thorns. And there's a thief on his right and a thief on his left. And then he's crucified. And then it's dark, totally dark for 3 hours in the middle of the day. And then Jesus cries his last. And when the centurion saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly, this man was the Son of God. And where was Mark writing? And who was he writing to? Persecuted Christians living in Rome.